everyone and the dog, we are good to go.
All
In
right.
Colorado. This is so great. Everybody rallied. We did it.
Woohoo!
I am so excited, and thank you so much to everyone who's taking the time to be online on camera on Friday night. So I really hope we can have as much fun. You know how Facebook brings up memories, and it brought up 3 years ago at the finalist reading for the mystery and thriller categories, which is next week. So these are just so much fun. So I hope you really enjoy these and that you take advantage of the conversation aspect that Chris has worked so hard to set up. So first of all, I have to start there. We wouldn't be here without Chris Goff saying, sure, we'll figure that out.
Yes.
So a round of applause there. Everything we do at Colorado Humanities is a team effort. And from Brenda Shingles, our Director of Operations, who's been scrambling to get things working, to Tanya Albright, who's co-hosting tonight as just a technical backup for us. I think somewhere Maggie Coble's online, and probably I see some Bess Mayer, our former Colorado Center for the Books coordinator, is here. It's just a real reunion. So thanks, everyone. I'll let you just know a tiny bit about how this will go. We ask the finalists and speakers to mute your microphones unless you're the one talking, and that might be you as a participant who's been recognized to ask a question. So we're really trying to mimic the conversation that we create at the book bar. Chris will help us all figure that out. If you're an attendee right now, I see we have 17 in attendee status. Your microphones are muted. Chris can communicate about how that will work. But we invite you to introduce yourself if you wind up being stuck in attendee status, and letting us know you're here by typing your name and any contact information you want to share in the chat so that people can just see that. Now, if you have a question for the authors, please type it in the Q&A feature, and then the authors can see that and just recognize you. So you really will get to have that conversation with the authors. And although we're online this year, instead of snug in the book bar with a treat and a beverage, we can still purchase books through the book bar's website. This will support local businesses, right? And Book Bar remains our co-host for the readings. They're happy to mail them. Our sponsors also continue their support. Denver-based Outskirts Press has been a longtime sponsor of Colorado Center for the Book, and stands ready to help authors develop, publish, and market their books. And Colorado Sun is providing funding and is featuring weekly Sunlit excerpts and interviews with many of our Colorado authors' books. We want to thank them, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and all of you for being here. So if you would indulge me and use hashtag CO Humanities at Home and hashtag CBA 2020 as we post about our experiences with the finalists and their work tonight. I am delighted to welcome Nicky Beer as our MC. Nicky Beer is the author of The Octopus Game, which changed my life in terms of how I look at octopus. People, it's the way I think of them now, and The Diminishing House, both winners of Colorado Book Award for Poetry. Her other awards include a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts, a Ruth Lilly Fellowship from the Poetry Foundation, a MacDowell Colony Fellowship, and a scholarship from the Bread Loaf Writers Conference, a Mary Wood Fellowship from Washington College, a Discovery of the Nation Award, and a Campbell Corner Prize. Her poems have been published in Best American Poetry, The Nation, The New Yorker, The Southern Review, Kenyon Review, and elsewhere. She is an associate professor at the University of Colorado, Denver, where she co-edits the journal Copper Nickel. Thank you for spending Friday evening with us, Nicky. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Josephine. And I too would like to extend my thanks to Chris Goff for her work on this event, as well as to the Colorado Center for the Book. It is an honor to be introducing these distinguished members of the Colorado literary community tonight. I'm pleased to introduce you to 10 talented writers whose books have been named by Colorado Book Award selectors as the finalists in general fiction, literary fiction, and poetry categories. The finalists from the general fiction category will start, followed by finalists in the literary fiction category, and then poetry. We'll try and move quickly. Our first reader tonight is Aimie Runyan, reading from her general fiction novel, Girls on the Line. The author of 4 historical novels, including 1 international bestseller, Runyon writes to celebrate history's unsung heroines. Her latest novel is a historical novel Society Editor's Choice for February 2019. An active educator and speaker, she lives in Colorado with her 2 usually adorable children.
Thank you so very much. Girls on the Line is definitely a passion project of mine. It was a book that was suggested to me by another local author, Sean Vogel. He suggested the topic because it really is kind of what I do. It's about women who are sent into extraordinary circumstances. It's about the women, as you might be able to tell from the cover, the women who were telephone operators in World War I. And they played a hugely important part in the war, but we often don't learn about them in the course of our schooling. And so it was, just a pleasure being able to, I spoke with the granddaughters of these women, the lawyer who won their case because they were denied their veteran status until 1979. So they didn't get their pensions or any of their veterans benefits until most of them sadly had passed on. But they did keep the legal battle up over the course of decades to be able to be recognized. And so it truly was an honor to be able to tell their story. And I'm just going to read a short section that takes place when the women are actually still on their way over to France. And it is the main character, Ruby. It is kind of her first moment where she's the adultiest adult in the room, so to speak. She's kind of been thrown into being in charge of her entire group. She's a chief operator because she had been named a supervisor but got promoted literally on the crossing over. It's just something that actually happened because the chief operator fell ill. And so I'm going to read a short passage from the crossing, which was rather perilous because they were crossing the English Channel and they were quite worried that they were going to be torpedoed by the Germans, and they were there was no they were under the cover of fog, but they knew that, and so they were stuck. But if the fog lifted, then they were kind of fair game for the German U-boats and other things. So this is kind of Ruby's first taste of what it was like to be in war. So Hazel accepted the apple gratefully. Her cheeks regained a bit of color from the nourishment. A few other gazed with poorly concealed longing at the small morsel of fruit that was now nearly gone. I'd have given Father's fortune to give them all a hot steak dinner, woolen blankets, anything to ease the discomfort. I took to pacing the decks to warm myself. Time had a way of playing tricks after so long at sea. I couldn't tell how many hours were left until the sun would rise again, hopefully to burn off the fog and to see us off to the coast of France. But even that could not give me comfort. The sun rose and shone bright enough to clear the path for us. Our cover too would be lost. Fatigue weighed heavy on us, but tempers remained cool. I was proud of the girls who huddled together against the bitter night. I racked my brain for something to help, but I drew a blank. I'd spent so long with Mother contradicting every decision I'd made. I'd grown accustomed to her just supplying the correct course of action before taking a step. What should I do? I whispered to Margot. They're miserable. Lead them, she whispered back, her eyes piercing. Get their minds off it. I shook my head at my own indecision. Let's walk, I suggested to my squad. It'll stave off the cold better than any blanket. Each woman rose at my suggestion and followed my lead, walking briskly around the deck of the ferry, and the other 2 squads soon followed suit. Well done, Margot whispered. The creases of worry on my brow the creases of worry on the brows had lessened noticeably. It was my father's response to anything, I said. Whatever the problem is, take a constitutional. It might solve the problem, but at least you'll get some fresh air to clear out the worry. He was right about that more often than not. He sounds like an astute man, she said. He must be proud. He seemed to be, I said. I didn't avow to her that his pride was tempered with fear in almost equal measure. The rays of the sun breached the horizon shortly after that, and there were a few gasps and muted shrieks when the ferry made a terrible screeching sound. Had the Germans spotted us once the cloak of night lifted? The screech gave way to the rumbling whir of engines, and at last the metal tub began to creep forward toward the French coast. I was able to breathe deeper as soon as I felt the firm ground beneath me, though I knew I'd just set foot on the most dangerous place in the world. Are you afraid? Margot asked, reading my expression as we walked off the pier and toward the train station. I was, but somehow stilled the shaking of my hands and the quiver in my voice. Incredibly, but I'm pretty sure that before long we're all going to be too busy to notice. So there you go. Ruby's first taste at having to lead her troops. So thank you.
It looks like there are some remarks about a beautiful reading.
Oh, thank you so much.
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat right now, but there'll be more of an opportunity towards the end of the section to ask questions again. So moving along, we'll go to our next reader. Our next readers tonight are a duo, authors Linda Lafferty and Andy Stone, reading from their general fiction novel, Light in the Shadows. Linda Lafferty is a two-time Colorado Book Award winner, and her books have been translated into 10 languages. She holds a doctorate in bilingual special education and taught in Spain for 3 years. Lafferty is also an avid equestrian and horse lover. Andy Stone began his career as a reporter for the Aspen Times and then worked his way up to publisher, winning numerous awards for his columns along the way. He retired from the newspaper in 2016. Stone has 2 other published novels. Andy and Linda, take it away.
Okay, well, I'm going to start by talking about the book a little bit. The book is Light in the Shadows, and it's based on the story of Caravaggio, the Italian painter, one of the great masters in the history of painting. And he lived from the late 1500s until the very early 1600s. And our book has 2 storylines. One is an historical storyline set in the time of Caravaggio, and the other is a contemporary line. The historical storyline covers a little bit of Caravaggio's early life, but primarily the last years of his life. He was, in addition to being a towering genius, he was also, as one of our reference books referred to him as, art history's resident thug. And he was indeed that. He was constantly in trouble. He was arrested any number of times. He was in jail a number of times. He had a violent temper, and it would just get away from him, and it caused him immense trouble. And in fact, those last years of his life, he spent on the run from a death sentence handed down by the Pope after Caravaggio killed a man in a duel in the streets of Rome. And so after that incident with death hanging over his head, Caravaggio fled Rome and headed south in Italy. And of course, then in those days, Italy was city-states. There wasn't a country. So once he was a little bit outside the immediate area of Rome, he was safe from the Pope's vengeance, or at least direct vengeance. Caravaggio went on to Naples and then to Sicily and eventually even as far as Malta. And wherever he went, he would, even on the run, he would stop and paint these astonishing masterworks. And he would also get in incredible trouble. He just couldn't help himself. His temper would get away from him and he would just wind up in trouble. He would destroy everything he had created. And in fact, in Malta, after painting one of the great masterpieces of his career, he wound up in so much trouble, he wound up thrown in a dungeon in Malta, from which he staged a daring escape, continuing on the run and eventually dying under mysterious and somewhat disputed circumstances at age 39 in 1610. That's the historical storyline. The contemporary storyline has three characters: a retired American college professor who is in Italy attending an art seminar, a young woman, an Italian-American graduate student who is also attending that seminar, and a strikingly handsome young Italian man. The three of them wind up entangled with a painting, not physically entangled, but they're involved with a painting which may be a lost Caravaggio. That painting is then stolen, and the three of them wind up trying to track down that painting and also track down its provenance to see if it's truly a Caravaggio painting. And they wind up retracing a lot of Caravaggio's path in the last years of his life. At the same time, there are people who are desperately sworn to keep that painting from ever seeing the light of day for reasons that date all the way back to those violent last years of Caravaggio's life. So that's what the book's about. And now to give you a sample of it, Linda Lafferty. Linda?
All right. Roma, 1600. A gust of wind whistled down the ragged hole in the roof of the tiny apartment on Vicolo San Biagio. A few minutes' walk from Piazza Navona. Dry leaves skittered down a gap in the rafters, the wind teasing flames to leap in the lanterns, hoisted above a young boy sitting on the floor with the bedsheet twisted around his shoulders and his stomach. 29-year-old Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio uncurled his finger from the paintbrush to rub soot from his eye. The blackened ceiling, thick with carbon from smoking oil lamps and torches, showered black flecks onto the artist and his subject. "Stai fermo, Cecco," he said, raising a bushy eyebrow. "Hold still." "The wind," said Cecco, shivering in the makeshift white toga. "A rainstorm, maestro." The artist looked at the prickled skin of the 13-year-old, the fine hair standing on end. Rain wept through the hole in the roof, the droplets plastering the gauzy bedsheet against the boy's body. "Al diavolo," growled the artist, flinging his paintbrush across the room. "To the devil, I'm finished for the night." The boy's eyes grew wide, but he remained silent, scrambling to retrieve the paintbrush. "Wash up the brushes and cover the paints. I'm going to the tavern," said the master, throwing a tattered velvet cape over his shoulders. "Si, maestro," said the boy. The toga slipped from his body, and he set about his duties, still nude. Caravaggio studied the boy's thigh where it met his buttocks, the indentation at his flank of muscle under the white skin. God's perfection. He felt himself stiffen under his coarse linen breeches. "Put on some clothes before you catch cold," he told the boy. "It won't do to have Bacchus with a red nose and phlegm, you shivering brat." He slammed the door, leaving Cecco alone in the drafty room. Caravaggio strode down the Via d'Agostino. A sword clinked at his side. He ran the risk of being arrested for carrying a weapon without a permit. He was no longer under the Cardinal Del Monte's roof and had lost his protection. The local guards knew that, but he would not go out without his sword. Finito.
Bravo, bravo.
Grazie.
Thank you very much, Linda, and thank you very much, Andy.
Our pleasure.
I'm looking here. I'm not currently seeing any questions. I do have a remark from Teresa McCoy after Andy's description, saying, "I want to read this book after that description." And then I hear a bravo from Jerry and a wonderful from Hannah. We do have a question. Can you see it in the chat, or should I read it aloud?
Let's see.
Don't see it.
No, don't see it. Let's see if I can do this.
The question is, did you spend time researching this book in Italy?
Oh, yes.
We did. Andy, take it away.
Well, earlier we spent several months living in Siena over the years in Italy, and then specifically for this book, we spent several months, several trips. We went to Rome, and then we traced that entire trail of Caravaggio. So Rome, Naples, Sicily, and Malta. Who could resist?
Yeah.
I know I'm not the only person here who's jealous.
You can do this, but not under quarantine, no.
Someday. Thank you so much, Linda and Andy. And let's move on to our next reader. Our last reader in the general fiction category is Bruce Holsinger, reading from his novel, The Gifted School. The author of 3 novels, one currently in development with NBC Universal Television. His essays and reviews have appeared in the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, the Washington Post, and Slate. The recipient of several major awards, he is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship. Bruce, take it away.
Wonderful, thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here and with these other wonderful authors. So The Gifted School is a contemporary family drama that imagines what happens when a school for exceptionally gifted children opens in an affluent Colorado town. So it's very much a front range novel. And the story takes place in Crystal. It's a fictional town that's a lightly reimagined Boulder. And it's told from the point of view of a number of mothers, fathers, children, even a grandmother, who are all affected in various ways by the culture of competitive parenting surrounding this new school. The novel centers around a group of families who all have rising 6th graders and all want spots for them in this new magnet school. So it's also the novel about friendship, about family, about marriage, and parenthood in a cutthroat environment. I started sketching out The Gifted School something like 15 years ago when my wife and I were living in Boulder with our 2 young sons. So in some ways, this novel has been in my skull for a long time. And the epigraph is actually a sentence from a book written by my mom, who was a Montessori school teacher. She wrote a book a number of years ago called The Little Boy Book, which is about child development. And I was working on this novel, and I kept remembering this sentence that she had written, this passage she had written in her book about gifted education. And I went back and found it, and I used it. It's the very first sentence in the book. It's the epigraph. And it reads, there's something so tantalizing about having a gifted child that some parents will go to almost any lengths to prove they have one. And that, in a nutshell, really is the theme of The Gifted School. I did have a certain amount of luck with the timing of the novel. Advanced copies were circulating when news of the college admissions scandal broke. And of course, that was a whole national story about affluent parents going to ridiculous, in their case, illegal lengths to get their children into prestigious schools. So that was the environment in which the book was received. The Wall Street Journal even called The Gifted School the novel that predicted the college admissions scandal, a dubious honor, I think. But if you think of the admissions scandal as one of the great cultural parables of our time, I think it can teach us a lot. And my hope with the novel is that it would be read kind of as a parable in its own way for thinking about issues of economic status and privilege hoarding and so on, as they affect the lives of many different people in different communities. The passage I'll read you is from the point of view of my protagonist. Her name is Rose. She's a pediatric neurologist. So she thinks all day in her laboratory about children's brains, but she's also completely obsessed with the brain of her own daughter, Emma, who you'll hear about a little bit in this passage. So this is just a little bit from The Gifted School. Late that night, with Gareth and Q asleep, Rose sat out on the living room couch, still shredded from the encounter, but distracting herself by prepping an upcoming lecture and slides for grand rounds at the medical center. Seizures, slurred words, loss of motor control, eventual paralysis. Whenever she described her work on neurodegenerative disorders in pre-adolescent brains, Rose felt as if she were narrating the prologue to a horror novel. The question was how to pitch the subject for first and second years, how to spur their interest in this obscure corner of pediatric neurology. The family of diseases she studied in her lab was rare enough that Rose had met only 12 patients with infantile diagnosis since she'd started working on the terminal disorder 7 years ago. These years of research had convinced her that her team had revealed a new pathway to treatment, that the particular enzymatic mechanism she had isolated held the key to a much wider range of neurodegenerative disorders. Finding that key would require money and time, too much of both, and the field of neurology was fiercely competitive. But give her 5 years and $5 million and she would tame this monster tearing through the brains of the young. 2 MRI images glowed from her screen, close-up cross-sections of an atrophic parietal lobe, the decay highlighted in the red PowerPoint circles and arrows she had just added to the slide. Below the image, her cold description of its pathology. She looked away into the darkened kitchen, the brains of the young. The stove clock ticked to 2:12 a.m., and her thoughts churned over the fraud exchange with Azra, Beck's gaslighting of other parents, Azra's frustrations with her sweet boys and her annoying friends. Rose's work had taught her never to take Emma's health for granted, though maybe it was too easy for all of them to lapse into a glib complacency with these constant parental worries about achievements and test scores, the invidious but inescapable comparisons. She took one final glance at her screen before shutting her laptop and stealing into Emma's room for the day's last look at her little girl, a soft kiss on that forehead. Survivor's guilt, now incarnate in her daughter. Every night, Rose came home from her mouse brains and her next-gen sequencer to whisper an agnostic's fierce blessing down through the skull and into the thriving brain of her only child. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bruce. Well done.
Thank you.
Congratulations. See, I'm looking in the chat to see if we have questions. Seems like we're having some visibility difficulty. Chris, I'm assuming you're on that. Okay, great. In the meantime, let's move on to finalists from the literary fiction category. Our first reader is Brandi Homan, who will read from her literary fiction novel, Burn Fortune. Homan is the author of 2 books of poetry, Hard Reds and Bobcat Country, from Shearsman Books, and she holds a PhD from the University of Denver in English Creative Writing Fiction. Brandi.
Thanks, Nikki, and thank you everyone, and especially the Colorado Center for the book. This is wonderful. I'm going to read from Burn Fortune, and it is the story of June, who is a 16-year-old girl in rural Midwest in the 1990s. She twirls a flag on the high school flag team, and she is surrounded by women who are either being abused or are feel trapped in their own lives. As a result, June starts looking for an alternative, some other role models, and she discovers the actress Jean Seberg. Some of you may know her from Breathless, the Godard French New Wave film. And as a result of discovering Jean, she also discovers Joan of Arc, who is one of Jean's most famous roles. I'm going to read from the middle of the book. So this is right when June starts discovering Jean Seberg and her films, and at one point she kind of starts narrating Jean's films to herself in this section. So just remember that a couple things. A Bout de Soufflé is the name of the Breathless, the French film. And just remember, this is in the voice of a 16-year-old girl, okay? So, Jean Seberg. I start asking if anyone knows the actress in the auditorium posters. Marcy doesn't, my boyfriend doesn't. I asked flag team sponsor, Coach T, who says Jean was from here and got kind of famous, but mostly in France. No big deal. She thought she'd seen some of Jean's movies. Jean was decent. Airport, maybe. The mouse that roared. Tell me more about this mouse, I say. Metaphor, she says. Paint Your Wagon. Paint Your Wagon is the only Jean Seberg movie the library has. The librarian, Mrs. Devereaux, brings me her own copy of Jean's biography from home, says she'll order more films. This movie is about some miners going west to look for gold. In the opening credits, it's an all scruffy-looking men. It hits me that I know the theme song. We sang it in chorus in the 4th grade. Where am I going? I don't know. Where am I heading? I ain't certain. All that I know is I am on my way. Whoa, there are no women in the whole town, and when Jean comes to visit, her husband, who already has another wife, Mormons, auctions her off. The man who wins is a falling down drunk who has Clint Eastwood argue for him. No wonder people love Clint Eastwood. I didn't know he ever looked like that, pinched but not the shrunken head he is now. Oh my God, Clint Eastwood is singing. Of course, Jean falls in love with Clint instead of his scurvy friend she was forced to marry. What, oh my God, she marries him too. She marries Clint, she has 2 husbands. We sang the theme song for 2 husbands in 4th grade, and they say the word horny several times. This is one fucked up movie. At the end, the whole city falls to the ground. Maps. After that weird polygamy mining musical, Gene Seberg has my attention. How do you start from here and end up there, born and raised? Luck. The biography Devereaux gives me says the director picked Gene out of 18,000 hopefuls to play Joan of Arc in his movie St. Joan. I can't get picked first of 20 for dodgeball. I can twirl a flag like a motherfucker, though. Ask anyone. A bout de souffle. This guy looks like an idiot, holding a cigarette in his mouth like that. A pervy idiot looking at high school girls on the side of the road. Nothing like sunshine. He points his gun at his reflection in the mirror. The camera's all blurry and I'm kind of dizzy. He kills a man and runs across a field to dramatic music, jazz hands. I'm bored already. Does he have herpes? He keeps rubbing his lip. He steals her money while watching her take her clothes off. Kind of like how Marcy used to go upstairs and dance behind the screen during teen night at the club on the edge of town called The Box. Everyone knew who was taking her clothes off. Everyone was watching. Here's Jean, finally. She's so beautiful, like movie stars are beautiful. She does kind of look like an elf, though. She reminds me of that creepy dude who has mushrooms painted all over the roof of his house, gnomes in his front yard. But elf dude's face looks hard. Why don't you wear a bra, her co-star asks, pokes Jean in the boob. Live dangerously until the end. He crosses himself and walks away. The camera keeps spinning. I'm dizzy and their ties are terrible. If he does that thing with his lip again, I'll just die. That's the worst fake karate chop I've ever seen. What? He just asked her to sleep with him? Says it out loud on the sidewalk in front of God and everyone? Just like that? Why are you so mean? He asks. Why are you so sad? She says. If I could dig a hole to hide in, Jean says, I would. She kisses the new guy but doesn't move her head. The lights come on all at once. Jean looks at herself in the store window, pats her tummy. Is she supposed to think she's fat? He's waiting for her naked in her own bed. She brushes her eyebrow with a hairbrush. He talks to himself in the mirror, hides his head under the sheet. She holds a teddy bear. Give me a smile, he says. If by 8 you haven't smiled, I'll strangle you. I'm pregnant, she says, washing her feet in the toilet. Of course she is. She's wearing stripes, like a convict. She wants to go to Mexico, and the siren is so loud. She has a bruise underneath her fingernail when she smokes. Take off your top, he says. Take off your top. It feels like how when Kent Burke tells Marcy to show him her tits. He says it again and again. Jean looks like she never believes herself when she smiles. I will never forgive her for that. Smiling when he says so. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brandi.
Thank you.
I'm looking over to the chat to see if we have any questions, and I'll remind folks that there will also be time for questions for all the finalists at the end of the reading as well. So if you don't manage to squeak in a question right after the author reads, you'll still have time at the end to ask. Brandi, you were told by Wendy Fox that you rocked it out.
Thanks, Wendy.
Our next reader is Wendy J. Fox, reading from her literary fiction novel, If the Ice Had Held, the author of the collection, The 7 Stages of Anger and Other Stories, and the novel, The Pull of It. Her work has appeared or is forthcoming in The Rumpus, BuzzFeed, and Self, as well as in literary magazines, including Washington Square, Euphony, and Painted Bride Quarterly. Wendy, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to read from If the Ice Had Held. Of course, I'm not going to set it up because it's just the first 2 chapters. Chapter 1, Kathleen, Winter, 1974. Kathleen wondered why, if half the human body was really made of water, how water could be so dangerous. Her brother Sammy had split the ice of the river trying to cross, and he floated to the shore, found by a townie cop before he was even missed. She didn't understand if he wasn't sunk, why the river couldn't lift him, glide him to the banks until his toes touched gravel and he put his legs down and walked into the night, glistening with cold, yes, lips blue, yes, skin brittle to the touch, clothes sopping in the hem of his jeans just starting to freeze, but still with breath, heat from his lungs condensing the air around him. Instead, the officer heaved him from the water in the dark of the winter evening, Sammy's teenage body sharp with ice. Chapter 2, Melanie, spring 2007. The software company in Denver where Melanie worked was in the majority of how startups ran, less glamorous than the swanky .coms of Silicon Valley with their organic catering menus, on-site yoga, and complimentary massage coupons, and more high-acid paper files sweltering under the heat of 100 laptops, payroll cobbled out of a questionable rev rec process, and strings of code written under the damp pressure of a hangover. Their space was not sky high and bathed in clean filtered light, but rather it occupied the ground floor of a crumbling office park. The job gave Melanie enough money to help her mother, Kathleen, and it gave her enough order to dampen the feeling of spinning she'd always had, if only for a moment. And since she worked in tech, the model was acquisition, and she was not naive. The model meant that the founders and a few of the earliest employees would cash out, and the rest of them would stay in the office, typing toward a different destiny. Are there going to be layoffs? She had asked her boss. Her boss told her not to talk about it. Her boss told her not to make any stock purchases of the publicly traded parent. She didn't think their little company being absorbed into a conglomerate would make even a blip in the markets, but she swore to secrecy anyway. And later, when she was not let go, and she told her new co-workers at headquarters in Chicago that she had to look them up, they were shocked. We're on the Fortune 500, they had said. Right, she had said. There are 500 of those. And she wondered if people who had gone to business school memorized this list, like the state capitals or the names of the saints. Thanks.
Sorry about that. I'll say that all again. We have remarks in the chat that say, Elizabeth Franklin is saying, I am reading this novel now at home. It is crafted so beautifully. Teresa McCoy says, this is my nominee for favorite book title, and it is so much more. Brandi told you killed it. And Bess is asking if you're at Book Bar right now.
I did not break into the book bar. It's just a custom background.
Oh, that is so cool. Well, so far, I think you win for best background. Thank you so much, Wendy. The last reader in the literary fiction category is Erika T. Wurth, reading from her novel, You Who Enter Here. A professor of creative writing at Western Illinois University, Wurth is the author of one previous novel, 2 collections of poetry, and a collection of short stories. She is Apache, Chickasaw, Cherokee, and was raised outside of Denver. Erika, take it away.
Thank you so much, and thanks to everyone for attending. I'm actually really grateful to Brandi, though, for breaking the F-bomb ceiling immediately. Every time I do a reading, somehow, you know how they're always like in the kids' book section, and here I am like F-bombing it the whole way, and people are strolling their kids through and just clapping their hands over their ears. So thank you, Brandi, for that. I'm going to read an extremely short excerpt from You Who Enter Here. It's essentially a Native gangs novel. I noticed that even though in Canada, a lot of Natives were talking about the subject matter in documentary and in film, and that's sort of happening, at least a documentary here. Natives seem to not be talking about that as much here, and I couldn't quite understand why. And you see it in small towns, on reservations, and urban Indian areas. And I wanted to write, you know, as usual, like a very urban Indian story to make sure that was part of the picture. So the novel's about Matthew, who's actually this very quiet, very readerly boy who was raised in an extremely abusive home, and he's, you know, gotten scooped up by a gang to sort of have a community, and it's this is a little tiny little bit of it. And he's a teenage boy, just so that, you know, again, like, you know, people understand this is clearly not me. We got mad respect now, yo, Chris said, and we about to blow up. Though this made Matthew feel uneasy, he walked around posing in goofy, exaggerated rap postures, bending deeply to the floor like he was Eminem and posing for the camera, his lips kissing the air hard, his arms wrapped around his thin body. Chris laughed, smoke shooting out of his mouth as he did. Prison had been all about hiding razors in his mouth, in his ass, about yellow cards outside his cell identifying him as native and in a gang, about fish lines moving toward him in the dark his first night in, about talking with Stanford, an OG in the 505s that had been in there for a few years and was about to be let out, about weeks in isolation, living with your mind tearing itself apart, about learning, about throwing signs when he knew that no one but the person they were meant for was looking, about reading when he had a few minutes to himself in the prison library. Most importantly, it had been about making new connections. In prison, Matthew had finally been ranked in. It happened in the laundry room, the washers and dryers making a loud clanking noise that covered everything. He was told he would be a fucking woman if he cried out just one time. The man who hit him first was a homie who had been in for a good long time and a survivor of a number of shootouts, Jose. He and Matthew had talked in the weight room together, lifting, Matthew spotting for him. Jose was short but huge and covered in tattoos, his arms spilling ink from one shoulder to the other. The Roadrunner, New Mexico-style women with long black eyelinered eyes and huge breasts. The state of New Mexico with those distinctive lines on top indicating Aztec blood and language. The Thunderbird with 505 and Roman numerals across his chest. And scars from bullets in his side, his leg, and half a pinky missing from when he was ranked in a few years back. Take it, bitch, one of the men waiting to join yelled. He was new. They were making all kinds of new friends. Friends who could do things for them, friends who were part of the Mexican gang that was going to bring in new drugs, line up more junkies. Jose's fist was coming down, hard, his face a sharp, expressionless line of grim determination. And Matthew waited for it like it was a sunset. He held himself up for as long as he could, taking the blows to his face, his shoulder, his sides, until Jose's friend began to kick him in the legs and he buckled. That's when Chris came in. He looked over at him, keeping himself quiet, expressionless. He knew that this was a test for Chris too. They knew they were tight, but their ultimate loyalty had to be to the 505s. Chris kicked him hard, taking turns with Jose and the other guy until he was all the way down, his arms covering his face like a child. And he began to bleed in earnest now, his mind blurring towards the gray, until finally a great wave of something washed him ashore and mercifully out to sea. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erika. And Wendy just told you that you crushed it. And l'chaim to you.
L'chaim.
Erika, actually, I have a question for you. The scene you just read was, you know, it was a pretty violent scene. And I was just wondering if there were any particular challenges in writing a scene like that.
Yeah, I think in general, my subject matter is dark. And I remember watching, it was like a documentary about bread loaf, which I would be teaching at this summer if it goes forward. And there was a poet, and she was talking about dark subject matter. And she was like, the way that you have to give it light is through the language. And so I think for me, I tried to push beyond stereotypes by making them complex human beings, which they are, which people forget. But for me, it was about also the language, like giving them some humanity, giving them some beauty through trying to push the language a little bit. And so that's what I tried to do when it, to push against how hard that can be.
Thank you very much, Erika.
Thank you.
We've got a thank you to you from Brandi. We've got a well done from Aimie. And now we are going to move on to the finalists from the poetry category. First up is Abigail Chabitnoy, reading from her book of poems, How to Dress a Fish. A poet of Unangam and Supiaq descent and a member of the Tunihanok Native Village in Kodiak, Alaska, Chibitnoy writes for magazines and is a research associate for Buber and Hall consulting firm for the indigenous population in Colorado. She works daily to improve tribal self-determination and engagement in the community. Abigail, please.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for attending Koyana. This is kind of surreal to be in this reading with my former mentor, Dan Beachy-Quick, who I first met what seems so many years ago on a rooftop in New York City as he was giving a reading, and I was just contemplating where I wanted to go for my MFA. So thank you for starting that journey. I grew up in central Pennsylvania, maybe less than an hour from the Carlisle Indian School. I went to cross-country meets and played soccer games there and knew that my great-grandfather had went there, but didn't really know anything else of the history. We knew our last name was a translation of a Russian word into salmon fisher, but we didn't really know what it meant to be Unangan, to be Aleut, to have this legacy of Carlisle in our backyard. And so my book is, in some ways, it's an attempt to push back against that historical erasure and also to engage with a culture and heritage that my family had been displaced from due to government policy that was meant to make us forget and to reduce that distance through language. So I'm just going to read a few of these poems. Family Ghosts. Michael, I wrote you a story. I didn't know what you did, what we did, if I should dig you up. But it didn't feel right. You should remain so far from the sea. It didn't feel right. I couldn't see you. Is this the shape these things should take? Chibitnoy, translation Salmon Fisher, Michael Chibitnoy, Aleut, 1886 to 1920. Because they were of the water, because they were given Russian names, he was born with hushed words. Because his mother had a bad heart and his father was traumatized, they took him from the sea. Because he came to the school charitably before, because there is only one photo after, they told the skeptics, yes, it could be done. Because it could be done, because Indian marries white girl, because he died of consumption, there are words I can't say. Because he was survived by 2 sons, because they were called half-breed, because that second son took to drink, I've always been afraid of the sea. Because it doesn't mean salmon fisher, because I need to know I can say these words, because it means mischievous, energetic. Mischievous men and women fish for salmon energetically. Because he was an orphan, because in summer my skin turns redder than my father's, because they asked my mother, is she adopted? Because I too am of the water, because I hear these words. I will split my bones and fit my skin to the sea. I will shape my mouth to angle these words with the wind. And this was the final poem to kind of give a scope of the work as it transverses from the historical into the mythical into explorations of language. Before there was a train, I built my home from perfumed skins and crooked bones, far from the rotting boat. They took the wrong shape. Sod, not ice, not body, not other. Nikik. Angluk Nicky Muk Patomok. The wrong tongue. By the time you read this, I will have forgotten how to say the house is covered with sod. Or home. Part of me wishes it had sunk, it sank, it is sinking. But these sentences have not been written. Only Ashrane Shuut Kachainek Pakutartut. Sometimes people salvage some stuff. Koyana, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Abigail. I have a remark in the chat from Elizabeth Franklin. The photographs, the way you insert empty frames on the page, and the way you arrange the words on the page created a strong impact on me when I read this beautiful book.
Well, thank you. So much of the story is full of holes, and as I did the research, I had more questions than answers. So that was kind of my way of saving space for what we still don't know.
We have a question from Nora Ridgway. Can you speak a little about the title of your book and its meaning?
Yeah, the title actually came together for me pretty close to the end. I was kind of working on a title of one of the poems in the book called She Gets Her Power from the Water. And as I started working on this book, I started to, well, I had to start by really interrogating my own Indigenous identity and my own claims to my heritage and relationship with my heritage and relationship to all of the stereotypes that we're constantly bombarded with in the media of what it means to be Native. And the more I started working, the more that title felt a little flippant, a little bit like everybody trying to come up with a Native name, like, oh, I'll string together some sentences and it'll be a name. And I really wanted to push away from those tropes, even though they were what I grew up with as well, displaced from my culture. I grew up as much learning how to be Native through books and through media as anything else. And so I arrived at this title as sort of a way to capture that performance of indigeneity and to capture what it means to dress up as a person of any kind of identity, but also then how to actually literally dress a fish, how to field dress a fish that one might have caught, how to dissect that body, how and why one would do that, whether it be for substance, whether it be for science or for a morbid curiosity, and trying to really capture all of these different questions I had of motives and identity and performance.
Thank you so much, Abigail. Now, David J. Rothman will read from his book of poetry, My Brother's Keeper. Now the Jackson Hole Center for the Arts Executive Director, Rothman has written several volumes of poetry and published poems in scores of other journals and books. He's the co-founder of the Crested Butte Music Festival and the Gunnison Valley Poetry Festival and Reading Series, and the founding publisher and editor of Conundrum Press, now an imprint of Bauer House Books of Denver. David, whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Nikki. I want to thank you and Josephine and Chris and everybody else who is here for bringing this together, along with Colorado Humanities, the Center for the Book Bar. It takes a lot of work to bring any event like this together, even virtually, and I'm very grateful. I also want to thank my publisher, Danny Rosen at Lithic Press out in Fruta, who believed in this book. The book, My Brother's Keeper, is an elegy, one poem in 7 parts, for my younger brother, who died in 1998 at the age of 37, he had just turned 37 2 weeks before, of a narcotics overdose. And it moves from grief to love, but it begins with grief. And I wanted to get as much of that feeling of grief that one would feel, you know, that I did feel, that many others have felt, graveside for someone who you love, who has died pointlessly of self-inflicted wounds, as I could. So this is where the book begins, and it's the other poems in the book are basically attempts over a long period of time to try to answer the questions poised here. So this is part one of My Brother's Keeper. What were you thinking, you goddamn stupid fuck? What were you thinking? What is up with that? I need an answer, Mike, because I'm stuck. Couldn't you see that you'd run out of luck one day and this is where you'd then be at? What were you thinking, you goddamn stupid fuck? Why couldn't you outgrow running amok, you psycho-narcodelic acrobat? I need an answer, Mike, because I'm stuck, still stuck on how you had to go and chuck your one sweet life on junk's shit ziggurat. What were you thinking, you narcissistic schmuck? Why did every day just suck so much? You needed dope's dark caveat. I need an answer, Mike, because I'm stuck. Here in the rain, I'd love to be awestruck. Oh, brother, answer my Magnificat. What were you thinking, you goddamn stupid fuck? I need an answer, brother. Oh, I'm stuck. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Actually, I have a question, David. I was wondering,
Yeah.
As you were putting this book together, were there any other books that were guiding or informing your work as you were working on this book that deals so explicitly with grief?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, very thoughtful. The book, two-part answer. The book, it was the strangest experience I've ever had in putting a book together. This is my 10th or 12th book. And I wrote these poems over 20 years and they were all scattered through different manuscripts. And the forms, the types of poems in the book are all quite different, although they are very carefully sequenced. And what happened was I literally woke up about 2 years ago in the middle of the night out of a dead sleep, not out of a dream. And there was a thought already formed in my head. And that's what I suppose we call the muse. I have no idea where it came from. That simply said, these poems all belong together and they should go in the following order. This is a book. This isn't just a bunch of different poems. I got up, I went to the computer at 4 a.m. I put them in that order. I went back to bed, got up the next morning and I went, who wrote that? That's how it actually came together. But as I was writing them, and then as I had to go and put some glue together, you know, to join them to each other just slightly, but not a lot. Basically, I looked very closely again at a very wide range of elegies, because this is a kind of an elegy. I mean, everything from, oh gosh, Milton to Wallace Stevens to, I mean, Dylan Thomas, obviously. And there's a lot of biblical material in there as well, and other passages, prayers and so on. So I because there is it's obviously one of the great subjects of all of our writing, grief, elegy, the mourning of the dead. And so yes, I paid attention to a lot of those in particular.
We have a question. Does the book progress through the stages of grief?
Well, not in the sense of Kubler-Ross's stages, no, but sort of. what really happens is that over a long period, what I find, well, it's sort of like giving away it's a bit of a spoiler, but not really. It's a poem after all. But it does have a strong narrative arc, and it ends with helping to prepare my younger son, Noah, whose middle name is Michael, which was my brother's name, whom he never met, to prepare my younger son for his bar mitzvah, which happens to be about Jacob wrestling with the angel, which is another scene of brothers fighting with each other. So there is a movement from grief to love, and there is acceptance in there. So they're in there. It's a very powerful concept, that notion of these stages, and I think that's certainly in there in one way or another, but not in a programmatic way. Although it does end with great love for another member of my family, in particular my son.
Thank you, David. And there's some other remarks in the chat that you'll probably want to have an answer at as well.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Our final speaker is Dan Beachy-Quick, who will read from his book of poetry, Variations on Dawn and Dusk. A poet and essayist, Beachy-Quick is the assistant chair of the English department of Colorado State University. He has published six books of poetry and is a Guggenheim Fellow. Dan, if you will.
Thanks so much, Nikki, and thanks for the heavy lifting of introducing everybody. It's a real honor to read with everyone, and an extra happiness to read with Abby, my former mentee, and hearing her read and talk about those poems reminds me of so many conversations and the joy it is to see everything come together in such wonderful kinds of ways. The book I'm going to read from was really meant as just a kind of private project for just a few friends. It comes out of visiting an art piece in Marfa, Texas, Robert Irwin's building, officially Untitled as its title, but known as From Dawn to Dusk. And to just give you a sense, when you walk into this building, which is shaped as a U, one half of it is painted this kind of brilliant white, and there's 18 windows, rectangles, symmetrical along one side, and a screen, the same white, bifurcating the entire long room. And then you walk through to another half that is painted this dusk, dark gray, kind of the color of the sky now. And the same windows repeat. It's this building of perfect symmetry that, depending on the hour of the day you walk in, can look quite different. When I happened to be there, there were these squares of light landing on the dark concrete floor, and these kind of perfect squares. And I'd never really been in an art piece whose nature wasn't exactly to look at what was on the wall or the particular spectacle of the image that can be seen, but so unexpectedly was an invitation for light to enter and be contemplated, the very medium that we see everything by, and because of that ubiquity, never really paused to think about it. And as I walked through these squares that didn't feel like a sequence, each felt like stepping into the square for the first time, I wondered how poetry could devote itself to the same simple necessities of learning how to think and learning how to see from the very beginning again. And I wanted to create a book that in some basic way replicated the possibility of that experience, mimicked it, imitated it. And so I created this form of these little squares in my mind where, if you read it, the first word of the first line rhymes more or less with the last word of the last line, and the last word of the first line rhymes with the first word of the last. However many syllables there are in the first line, every line will have that number of syllables, and that dictates the number of lines. So 6 syllables, 6 lines of 6 syllables. And so each one is one of these little squares of light. And I'll just read a few of them. It doesn't take more than 3 minutes really to read the entire book, to be honest. Can't put your hands around what isn't there, but can you put your mind around it? Can't open the door that isn't a door, but you can walk through it and come out the same you were before. Nothing is the living mirror of God, where love and soul embrace a window open, never not open, never not closed, where witness is trespass, prayer is want. Antique dove, I've long been student of, wings over vast water that never with olive sprig exactly returns. And the ruinous waters never drain down to the fundamental stone. I found only ecstasy of sea foam and cloud and altering cloud. I call the mind of God. Is it time of drawing shapes in plein air with sticks? Is to know again, life the already lived, love the already loved. Gnosis of the seen is the fact of the sun. No man and no man, I see my shadow and I know time rhymes with rhyme and mine. Sundial gone nomadic. The poem is, or as the sun itself, the child wishes his wish inside me. Cloud tufts of lion's mane blown far off to grow wild in witless fields, or just to think words make promises they keep, like the lamb lying down in the shadow of. The poem, dark like a shadow, is dark as ink. The blank page is what shines, relief gone to seed, oblivion's oath. Riddle that everything fits inside the space it's given. Even my own handmade thought, even my own handmade mind, builds the tool that takes the tool apart. Time is another method, so is the fiddle. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. And in the chat, Rosanna Frechette is thanking you for being multidimensional. We would now like to open it up for a last round of questions for any and or all of the finalists. And I'll keep my eye on the chat. Oh, we have a question from Josephine to Dan. Do you, this is a question for all the panelists. It sounds like Josephine is asking, do you hear or see your stories or poems first? So do you hear them first or do you see them first? What you're writing, is that correct, Josephine? Okay. If anyone wants to take that.
I mean, I'll take it. I was a poet. I have a couple of collections out, and I don't really write poetry anymore. But I think I'm very led by sound, and I'm very led by lyricism. And I think if even in writing very narrative prose, which I really believe in, and I believe in the story, I think that if the sentence doesn't sound right, it's still not going to work.
For me, I tend to be a very visual person, and so I do feel like I see my stories before I hear them. The voice does come very quickly after, but I feel like I spend a lot of time visualizing what my characters look like, what the settings look like, before I kind of get an ear for the voice or the music of the story.
And I see things as films. I see images, a script. Not a script, but I see things like a movie running through my mind.
I was actually inclined to say at first that I hear poems first, and I do to some extent, but I think I also very quickly shift to visualizing as well, because while a lot of my poems are very lyrical, they're also very narrative driven, although sometimes that narrative is only really fully understood internally. But then I do also spend a lot of time visualizing on the page, and the way I do my layout, I actually have to frequently remind myself to go back and read things aloud to make sure that yes, it does also have to carry that sound as well.
I have a question. Everybody's stories are very personal to something that's important for them to tell about their lives, or something that happened to them in their lives. So how did you come to that story? Because of the person, because of the overall sense of what you wanted to give to the reader, or how personal was it, the message you wanted to convey in your work?
I'd like to answer. Mine was really almost not a choice. It was such a tragic event in my life that it was inescapable. And if I was to be any kind of a writer who dealt with such large subjects, I had to address it. So that's where that began. But it wasn't merely about, I didn't simply want to write about my own experience. I wanted to write about the experience of being what it means to be a brother, what it means to be a good brother, what it means to try to move over time from grief to love. And not only to write something about the texture of my own life, although that's in there, because this is obviously something, the question of brothers fighting with each other and the death of a brother is, or the death of a sibling is an ancient theme, runs through the Bible along with, and classical literature as well, in Ovid and so on. So it gave me quite an opportunity to think about the power of those stories and try to contribute in my own way to them.
For me, I feel like for all my novels, but Girls in the Line perhaps in particular, it's all about telling the stories that have been silenced from women. So in a sense, my work is very deeply rooted in history before, I mean, granted, Girls on the Line takes place during the suffrage movement. And so there definitely are feminist themes that were happening, but even my earliest works that took place in the 1600s before feminism was even really a concept, as we understand it nowadays anyway. It's all about, as my tagline says, celebrating history's unsung heroines, because so many times in history, women's contributions have been ignored or sidelined or deliberately written out of history. And, in the case of these women that were telephone operators, they went for decades without being recognized for their service, and they weren't able to be seen in VA hospitals. This is not just about the medals on their shirt, which is a nice thing. This is about not getting pensions, not getting treatment in VA hospitals when they were entitled to do so, and countless other benefits that they were entitled to and needed that they didn't get because they were supposed to be good girls and go home, and they were told that because the Army Code of Ethics or whatever it's called said man and not person, that the women that enrolled in the U.S. Army Signal Corps were not. They were just contractors. And so Ruby was a character that leapt off the pages of my research reading. For me, I've never had a character kind of formulate out of the clay kind of so easily. And it's because I think that these women for decades have wanted their stories told. Definitely.
For me, that one of the dynamics comes from being really interested in family dynamics and how that those kinds of private exchanges within families, between parents and their children, between friends about their children, and the kind of crises that can lead to, and the little explosions that can happen between members of a family. So in the gifted school, I was trying to think about, you could almost call it the anthropology of families in a way, and how different they can be from each other, and how different they can be from within, from different points of view. And that's one of the ways I tackle those kinds of problems. Is I love writing novels that take place from a lot of different points of view, from a father's point of view, anguishing about his sons, to a daughter's point of view, thinking about her younger brother and the issues that he's having with their mom. And I think that's sometimes where, it also answers the other question too about, seeing or hearing. Often I'll begin, I think I'm a lot like Linda in that I'll see it, filmically or televisually, but I'll often begin in the moment of the setting of a chapter, because my chapters will click by and they'll have a lot of different settings. In this case, one might be on the sideline of a soccer field where a dad is getting really stressed out about how his kid is doing on the field. The next one might be inside a teenager's bedroom where she's filming an episode of her video blog, something like that. So it really, a lot of it depends on what's happening in the moment to generate that private world of any given scene.
My great-grandfather died of tuberculosis before my grandfather was born, and my grandfather drank himself to death before I was born. And so my work, at least in my first book, was really an attempt to reestablish these connections with family and to find out why my family didn't tell stories, and to reestablish those lines of communication. And I really did feel in a lot of my poems that I was addressing, I guess, like this larger sense of community and a larger family. And I've been fortunate that my work has actually reconnected me with relatives and cousins in Alaska through poems. And so that's been one of my, probably one of my favorite experiences as a poet, is to just find ways of rekindling these connections.
In the chat, Andrea Rogers is asking, could the writers talk about what they are working on next?
Well, I have a book coming out in August, Across the Winding River. So that's coming out very soon, and that's in advanced review forms, copy form at this point. And I'm working on some proposals for some new things. A little bit too early to talk about them, but hopefully coming out in 2021, 2022, sometime around in there.
And I actually have a book coming out on May 5th. It's called Fierce Dreamer. And it's the story of Artemisia Gentileschi, who was an incredible artist in the 17th century and overcame all odds. In fact, she was raped, but she became an incredible artist. And if you don't know her work, do look it up, because she's a powerhouse.
I'll go next. My next novel is, it'll probably be out next year, probably about a year and a half from now. It's called The Displacements, and it's a catastrophe novel. It's about these lives, these families who converge at a FEMA Red Cross mega shelter for displaced Americans in the wake of a massive hurricane that destroys Miami and Houston. So it's a very dark novel. The last thing anyone's gonna want to read after this, but that'll probably be next year.
I have a book coming out in July, a full-length collection called Arrows from Tupelo. And I've been studying ancient Greek for a number of years, like nearly a decade, I guess. And I have a book of translations coming out from the ancient Greek lyric tradition that will be out from Milkweed Editions in September.
I'll go. I've been working on a book called Kansas about that deals with religious and racial hatred, particularly in women. It's the story of Dolly. She's 20 years old. She's socially isolated, socially inept, and she's a postal carrier. And along her mail route, she meets a mother figure, and the mother figure invites her into a women's group that is essentially a hate group that functions like some of the 1920s hate groups did.
Well, keeping with the cheerful subject matter, my current work, I am working on re-examining, I guess, what I'm calling the stories we tell ourselves to survive, but in the context of violence against women, violence against Indigenous peoples, and violence against the landscape.
I'm working on a novel, and actually in between agents. I have a couple who have asked for the full. It's called White Horse. It's actually, the name is taken from the Indian bar in Denver, because I'm an Indian from Denver, and it's just this place of convergence. And so it's about a woman who has always resented her mother for abandoning her 2 days old, and leaving her father to, go into a state of despair and drink himself into an accident and brain damage, and left her to raise him. And then a letter surfaces that really complicates the narrative. And so she and her white cousin go into Oklahoma to figure out, what happened to her mother. Was she murdered? If she was, what's the story? Why was it never pursued? And so it was also kind of along the lines of missing and murdered Indigenous women.
This is Dave Rothman. I'm currently working on an Elk Cove Vineyards Pinot Gris. That's pretty good. In addition to that, I have a poetry textbook that co-authored with Susan Spear, based on the MFA curriculum that I built at Western, where I ran the MFA for a number of years. That's under contract with Springer. It's supposed to be out as soon as this pandemic allows us to just put a few finishing touches on it. It's almost ready. Beyond that, I'm a scribbler, and I have all these other projects that are sort of close to being finished. One is a study of the great California poet Robinson Jeffers, who I admire almost without reservation. Another is believe it or not, a book, a collection of essays on prosody, which I'm sure will be as popular as an invitation to a leper colony. And then I'm doing almost anything I can to write longer poems, long narrative poems. I want to try to somehow get myself to the place where I could imagine writing something as good and as sustained as something like Ludlow by Dave Mason, which I think is an amazing book, or The Folding Cliffs by W.S. Merwin, to try to fulfill the Virgilian rota and write something like an epic, if not an epic, that somehow works. I'd love to be able to write a book-length poem. I haven't gotten more than about 40 pages of anything that I can feel it deserves to be sustained. But I have a number of things I'm working on like that. We'll see if any of them go. It's sort of like just swinging for the fences, because at a certain point in your life, you have to try to do that you do your best, see if it'll work.
We have I think if there isn't anyone else who wants to answer that question about what they're working on next, we have a question from Sophie Breaker in the chat. How has the pandemic changed the book industry and environment for everyone? Oh, Wendy, you raised your hand? Unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted you to take me off the master mute.
So this question, how has the pandemic changed the book industry and environment for everyone?
Hasn't changed our life really at all. I mean, basically we write, and it's a quiet time, and we're kind of hermits anyway, quite frankly, and it's really been a contemplative time. I don't think that it's really deranged our schedule in any way.
I know
For me, I think the
Go
biggest
ahead.
change is I'm homeschooling now while I'm trying to get ready. That is definitely a big change. But aside from that, I think it's really early to tell what the real effects on the writing industry as a whole are going to be. To the process, it won't change anything. I think the one thing I've already seen is a push for more lighthearted and uplifting fiction in the coming months, and because that's what agents want to be reading right now, or editors rather. Agents too. Trust me, I think they all want to be. But as far as like actually getting paper books onto shelves and the ramifications on sales, we're going to see that in about a year. We'll see that in about a year.
And there's all massive numbers of layoffs in the publishing industry right now. There are a lot of imprints that are consolidating, and there's independent bookstores look to be, a lot of them look to be going out of business. That there's real talk of this being like a huge catastrophe for independent bookstores, let alone all the authors who are struggling to make ends meet. So I honestly think it's going to have an absolutely disastrous effect on the book industry. People will still write, there will still be publishers and so on, but just from everything I've read and other writers I've talked to, it really just looks horrific.
I want to respond to what Bruce is saying, because of course I think that's true in many ways, and especially at the retail end of things. I couldn't agree more, because obviously hard to have a bookstore if you can't open the store. That's why we're not at Book Bar tonight. At the same time, I've spent a lot of my life in the performing arts. I no longer run the Jackson Hole Center for the Arts because for personal reasons I had to return to Colorado, and I'm back in Crested Butte. But the people I know in the performing arts are, oh my gosh. I mean, if you're a dancer or a musician who makes a living on live performance, or someone who acts in the theater, I think the technical term for it is it's a total mess. Writers are fairly lucky because we have this culture of readings and so on, and of course bookstores matter tremendously. And I completely agree there's going to be a lot of disruption. So it's not I don't mean to absolutely disagree, but relatively speaking, in the arts,
With me,
as opposed to opera or dance or theater, wow, we are very lucky, because people are going to continue to read and buy books. Unfortunately, a lot of it may go to Barnes & Noble and Amazon in terms of ordering, but I think we're relatively lucky.
I think it's also really interesting that we have such an opportunity for maybe new genres to emerge, new digital forms. Speaking of the theater arts, how people are putting on plays now differently, like it's changing the genre literally. And so I think it's really exciting. Financially and everything else is total chaos, but there is this total potential there as well, and we have a moment and can appreciate that.
Well, that's probably a good place to leave it. And Josephine, I'll turn it over back to you to wrap up the event.
Sure. Thank you, Nicky, for this and your own amazing writing. And thanks to those of you who joined us for staying in and logging on. We'd love to hear what you thought about tonight's program in the chat or an email. Suggestions are welcome. Again, if you visit Outskirts Press or Colorado Sun, let them know you're there, because they support the Colorado Center for the Book. And you can order books from Book Bar. Our next finalist reading, our MC will be the fabulous Chris Goff for Mystery and Thriller next Friday. April 24th, I'll be there too at 7 p.m. Same place, different link, I think. And winners will be announced. We don't know what's going on. Stay tuned to our website and social media. We're getting a newsletter set up. There's a new opt-in for our newsletter. We'll be sending out messages. I'm sure you'll get them. And please stay well. Thanks for tonight.
Thank you so much.